Welcome to Michigan's presentation on significant disproportionality, a proactive approach. The purpose of the federal regulations is to promote equity in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. Specifically, the regulations are intended to ensure states meaningfully identify ISDs with significant disproportionality, and states assist ISDs in ensuring children with disabilities are properly identified for services, receive necessary services in the least restrictive environment, and are not disproportionately removed from their educational placements for disciplinary reasons. These regulations also address the well-documented and detrimental over-identification of certain students for special education services, with concern that over-identification results in children being placed in more restrictive environments and not being taught to challenging academic standards. ISDs are legally obligated to work with member districts to ensure appropriate identification of students with disabilities and provide the resources and supports they need to have equal access to education. Thus, states are encouraged to ensure the ISDs, child find policies, procedures, and practices are working effectively to identify all children with disabilities, regardless of race or ethnicity. IDEA requires states to take steps to determine the existence of and address significant disproportionality in special education. The statute and regulations for IDEA Part B include important provisions for how states must address significant disproportionality, including an examination of significant disproportionality and remedies where findings of significant disproportionality occur. Each year, risk ratios for discipline, identification, and educational settings are calculated for every member district and aggregated to the ISD level. This data, along with business rule and methodology documentation, are then provided to each ISD. Based on the calculated risk ratios, an ISD is placed in a tier. The threshold for over-identification in educational settings is a risk ratio of greater than 3.0 for 2 consecutive years. We use alternate or risk ratio dependent on the ISD's population. A risk ratio is calculated for both operating and resident ISD and district. Similarly, the threshold for discipline is a risk ratio of greater than 3.0 for 2 consecutive years. We use alternate or risk ratio depending on the ISD's population. However, only an operating risk ratio is calculated for each of the categories listed here. Michigan has developed a tiered level of support. When a state education agency, SEA, identifies ISDs with significant disproportionality in one or more of these areas based on the collection and examination of their data, states must, 1, provide for the review and, if appropriate, revision of the ISD's policies, procedures, and practices for compliance with IDEA. 2, require the ISD to reserve the maximum amount, 15%, of its Part B funds to be used for comprehensive, coordinated early intervening services, CCEIS, to serve children in the ISD, particularly, but not exclusively, children in those groups that were significantly over-identified. And 3, require the ISD to publicly report on the revision of its policies, procedures, and practices. Under the statute and regulations, each state has considerable discretion in how it defines significant disproportionality. To address and reduce significant disproportionality, the regulations establish a standard methodology that each state must use in its annual determination under IDEA Section 618D of whether significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the ISDs of the state. Further, funds reserved for required CCEIS now must be used to identify and address the factors contributing to significant disproportionality and may be used to serve children from age 3 through grade 12 with and without disabilities. Tier 2, these ISDs are considered moderately at risk, but are not identified for significant disproportionality. An ISD with a risk ratio greater than 3.0 and more than 0, but 1/3 or less of member districts within the ISD have risk ratios greater than 3.0. The 1/3 of member districts per ISD is based on a single area of identification. An example would be discipline, over-identification, or educational environments. If a member district exceeds the 3.0 risk ratio in multiple areas, the member district is only counted once in determining the 1/3 or less of member districts. At Tier 2, ISDs are required to implement a response plan. More on this in just a bit. Tier 1, ISDs meeting one of the following criteria are considered at risk, but are not identified for significant disproportionality. An ISD has exceeded the threshold of 3.0 for 2 consecutive years, but within the ISD, there are no member districts exceeding the threshold in the same areas of the ISD, or 2, an ISD and or its member districts have demonstrated reasonable progress. The OS, Office of Special Education, has defined reasonable progress to mean a year-to-year decline in risk ratio of at least 0.2 in each of the 2 consecutive years with data for the ISD and or the member districts exceeding the 3.0 threshold. Tier 0. If an ISD exceeded the risk ratio threshold in discipline, identification, or educational settings for 2 consecutive years, they are not considered at risk. But again, the approach is proactive. Therefore, all data is provided so ISDs can have an opportunity to address any potential concerns at the member district level. Tier 0 is the universal tier. The Office of Special Education provides guidance documentation which will be made available to all ISDs and access to Wayne State University's website to review aggregate and member district level data. Tier 1 is at risk for identification of significant disproportionality. The Office of Special Education will provide guidance documentation to all ISDs. Additional technical assistance is available from the Office of Special Education upon request for ISDs considered at risk to help review and analyze data and to provide additional assistance to decrease the ISD and member districts' risk ratio. Tier 2, moderately at risk for identification of significant disproportionality. ISDs in Tier 2 will have access to all universal technical assistance. Additionally, in Tier 2, an ISD is required to develop and implement a response plan for ISDs, moderately at risk for identification of significant disproportionality. The Office of Special Education will collaborate with ISDs in Tier 2 on the development and implementation of the response plan. The response plan will address areas of needed improvement at the ISD and within the affected member districts. Tier 3, the ISD is identified for significant disproportionality. When an ISD is in Tier 3, the ISD must, 1, provide for the review and, if appropriate, revision of the policies, procedures, and practices for compliance with the IDEA, and 2, reserve the maximum amount, 15%, of its IDEA Part B funds to be used for CCEIS to serve children, particularly but not exclusively, children in those groups that were significantly over-identified. And 3, publicly report on the revision of its policies, procedures, and practices. The Office of Special Education's response regulation 34 CFR 300.646 of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, requires ISDs must allocate 15% of IDEA Special Education Part B Section 611 flow-through grant, and procedures that ISDs in Tier 3 will have access to all of the universal technical assistance. The Office of Special Education will also provide intensive technical assistance to support the ISD, which may include remote and on-site support and training in addition to the technical assistance provided in Tiers 0, 1, and 2. As mentioned already in Tier 2, these ISDs are considered moderately at risk, but are not identified for significant disproportionality. An ISD with a risk ratio greater than 3.0 and more than 0, but 1/3 or less of member districts within the ISD have risk ratios greater than 3.0. The 1/3 of member districts per ISD is based on a single area of identification, so discipline, over-identification, or educational environments. A response plan is a requirement which includes a deeper data dive to help the ISD identify root causes contributing to the disproportionality. The goal is to identify correct issues before actually being identified with significant disproportionality. Michigan uses the data use and action process, which looks like a figure 8, as a recommended resource to assist in the root cause analysis. The overall purpose of the data use and action process is to build capacity to analyze and use data to take actions that will support member districts in improving results for all students with an IEP. The 8 steps in the Office of Special Education data use and action process are grouped into 4 phases similar to other frameworks for data use. The defining features of the Office of Special Education process is the emphasis on the iterative process of data use shown by the figure 8 and an explicit emphasis on organizing and assessing the data before analysis begins. The 8 steps create a continuous cycle for using data to guide pathways to improvement. In addition, we use and provide access to the following resources: the IDC Success Gaps Toolkit, available on ideadata.org, the Discipline Toolkit resources available on Catamaran, and we have resource-based practices also available on Catamaran. Thank you for joining Michigan today. If you have further questions, please contact Teri Rink at rinkt1@michigan.gov, Jessica Brady at bradyj@michigan.gov, or Julie Trevino at trevinoj1@michigan.gov. The contents of this presentation were developed by the presenters for the 2022 OSEP conference. However, these contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.